Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished absent guests. Today we'll be dipping into the history of great powers competition in the Indo Pacific. And because none of you are here to ask me questions, I've extended this one-way chat to about an hour and divided it into two videoed sections. The first video focuses on some early and more recent Chinese activity in the region, intra-Asian conflicts, European and American colonialism until the early 20th century, and early Australian security concerns. The second starts with the first great Asian victory over a European power and examines Australia's changing alliances, international engagement and defence strategy, decolonisation and the growing regional power of Asian states, in particular China. Both look at how history is used, abused or neglected by states. While the term Indo-Pacific was first coined in 1850 to describe a much smaller area, the modern usage, with reference to sea lanes of energy and trade across the two-ocean system, is an Australian innovation, first given prominence in Australia's 2013 Defence White Paper. Now, my presentation won't focus on the whole Indo-Pacific. Why? Because, to use an Australian technical term, it's bloody big. So I'll be skimming over great powers competition for territory, influence and basing in Southeast Asia over the past 500 years and in the Southwest Pacific over the last 250. I'll be applying an Australian historical lens, but I'll look at some earlier history, particularly around the Malacca Strait and in China's long-standing interest in the region, because the echoes of the distant past are still heard today. The Malacca Strait, which separates the Malay Peninsula from Indonesia's Sumatra, is the gateway between the Pacific and Indian Oceans, with Singapore the gatekeeper, as the strait is less than 3 kilometres wide to the island's south. Over 100,000 vessels, carrying over a quarter of the world's trade, pass through the strait each year. But let's start in a quieter place, the place where you'd be hearing this presentation if it weren't for the virus, Canberra. A place Australia's leaders decided to build in a frozen sheep paddock in the middle of nowhere because neither Sydney nor Melbourne could stomach the other as the capital. Canberra is a city built on neutral ground, in a territory that is neither New South Wales nor Victoria. Canberra is the embodiment of compromise. Canberra is also the place where Chinese President Hu Jintao addressed a joint sitting of the Australian Parliament on 24 October 2003. He opened with these words. Back in the 1420s, the expeditionary fleets of China's Ming dynasty reached Australian shores. For centuries, the Chinese sailed across vast seas and settled in what they called the Southern Land, or today's Australia. They brought Chinese culture here and lived harmoniously with the local people, contributing their proud share to Australia's economy, society, and its thriving pluralistic culture. This had all the hallmarks of a classic China peaceful rise speech. Culture, social harmony, peaceful and mutually beneficial relations with others. But it also had a powerful message. We were doing good things in Australia centuries before the British and other European powers. More bluntly, we were here first. President Hu's words were inspired by Gavin Menzies' 1421, the year China discovered the world. Menzies, a retired British submarine commander, advanced the startling theory that in 1421, Zheng He, a giant Chinese eunuch, led a fleet of over 100 aircraft carrier-sized ships to explore every single continent. Menzies contends that two of Zheng's equally genitally deficient admirals, Zhu Man and Hong Bao, split from the main fleet and separately discovered Australia's east and west coasts. Menzies relies on the groundbreaking work of the eminent Australian historian Rex Gilroy, first reported in a 1987 edition of Australasian Post, a publication well known for photographically charting the history of Australia's topless women. Gilroy's other articles for the Post include Stonehenge is Here, Space Aliens in Australia, Our Own Nessie, and Why Yowies Are Fair Dinkum. In just 16 short years, a story published in a lads mag would inspire the President of the People's Republic of China to claim centuries of Chinese settlement in Australia. I tell the story of President Hugh's extraordinary claim in my book Girt, available in all good bookstores, in a section sensitively titled Chinese Sailors with No Junk. Menzies' claims have also been junked, yet China continues to invoke Zheng He in creating a false history about China's sea trading and goodwill, with Zheng's so-called treasure ships reputedly carrying Chinese treasure to a grateful world. President Xi Jinping invoked Zheng He in Jakarta in 2013 when he announced China's new maritime Silk Road. He said of Zheng, his visits left nice stories of friendly exchanges between the Chinese and Indonesian peoples, many of which are still widely told today. Zheng He was real, and he made 7 voyages into the Indian Ocean between 1405 and 1433, the only years China projected military power into the Indian Ocean until 2008. However, Zheng's fleet did not visit Australia or most other continents, nor did it carry treasure to other peoples, but extracted it from them. China had demanded tribute from Asian states since the late 1200s, and Zheng's show of force encouraged them to pay it. Zheng considered and rejected establishing Chinese military bases outside China. China was not interested in colonisation, but in establishing a tribute system that recognised Chinese regional supremacy. And China was not interested in friendly exchanges or living harmoniously with the local people. You don't take 30,000 soldiers on a goodwill tour. Zheng launched assaults in Java and Sri Lanka, seized royal hostages, and threatened states disinclined to pay tribute with invasion. Zheng destroyed the remnants of the Buddhist Srivijaya Empire centred around Sumatra. Srivijaya, the first great maritime power in Southeast Asia, had controlled the Strait of Malacca and the Sunda Strait, and grew its wealth and power through trans-shipping cargoes between the Pacific and Indian Oceans, much as one of its territorial successors on the Strait of Malacca, Singapore, does now. China's quarter of a century of gunboat diplomacy ended in 1433, with domestic factors leading it to pursue a policy of isolation. Modern China has resurrected Zheng He to convince its own people, and neighbours and rivals if possible, that current Chinese maritime and economic activities under its Belt and Road Initiative are part of a long and benign tradition. This is the narrative of history as destiny. China had a great past, and it is natural and right that China should be great again. Imperial, Republican and Communist China have all sought to erase inconvenient truths from history, from the Taiping Rebellion to Tiananmen Square. The history of COVID-19 is already being rewritten. The current focus on fake news overshadows the dangers of fake olds. History is being weaponised. In June 2019, the US Department of Defence warned in its Indo Pacific Strategy report that China is a revisionist power. That is starkly demonstrated by its revision of history. While China uses history as a sword, history, as we shall see, can also be used as a shield against miscalculation and error. Australia, with its ancient ties to distant Britain, can't avoid the Indo-Pacific. Our land is, as we archaically state in our national anthem, girt by sea, with the Indian Ocean to our west and the Pacific Ocean to our east. Our maritime zone is some 10 million square kilometres, one of the largest in the world. So, what does history tell us about engagement in the Indo-Pacific? The first thing, and I know this is an air power virtual conference, is that it's all about the sea. But I hope you can apply some of the learnings to your own work. The Indian Ocean carries 1/3 of the world's bulk cargo and 2/3 of the world's oil. Australia, Southeast Asia, India, China, Japan, South Korea and Taiwan all depend on the ocean for energy, prosperity and security. Second, history emphasises the importance of Malaysia, Singapore, Indonesia, the Philippines and Papua New Guinea to Australian security, as any conventional attack would likely come through those states. Third, great powers have had different motivations in engaging in Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific. In Southeast Asia, sovereignty has been secondary to trade in much of the region's history. While trade has been a factor in Southwest Pacific competition, security arrangements, and promoting development along Western lines, a passion of 19th century Enlightenment types, have played proportionally larger roles. Fourth, Southeast Asia and the Southwest Pacific are incredibly dynamic. State boundaries, occupying powers, alliances, multilateral forums, all have been subject to rapid change. You can't look at these regions with 2020 vision. You need a little 2020 hindsight to understand the motivations of key actors. So, let's get back to the history. Before Srivijaya was wiped out by Zheng He, it lost control of the Strait of Malacca to the Muslim Sultanate of Malacca. The Sultanate relied on pirate crews to expand its territory. Now, you may find it surprising, but piracy has been a major factor in great power competition in the Indo Pacific. In 1512, the Sultanate fell to Portugal, the first Western power to establish itself in the region. Portugal had conquered Indian Goa the previous year, with these conquests designed to monopolise trade between Europe and Asia. Portugal had an additional motive: the elimination of Islam. In this it failed. Islamic refugees from Malacca fled to Brunei, with the Sultanate there flourishing and expanding into the Philippines. The Portuguese quickly moved into present-day Sri Lanka and the Moluccas, islands that produced spices that were worth more than their weight in gold in Europe. They expanded as far south as Flores and Timor to Australia's north, and built ports and forts to protect the spice trade. While Portugal was interested in integrating Southeast Asia into its Indian trading operations, the world's other great maritime power, Spain, wanted to develop trade between Southeast Asia and its American territories. From 1565, Spain conquered the Philippines and acquired territories in present-day Guam, Palau, the Federated States of Micronesia and Marshall Islands, as well as establishing defended ports in Sulawesi, the Moluccas and Taiwan. The colonial Indo-Pacific was split, with the Portuguese looking to the Indian Ocean and the Spanish to the Pacific. The Dutch Republic, which seceded from Spain in 1581, saw Southeast Asia as the arena in which it would assert its newfound independence. Using information on navigation obtained from spies within the Portuguese administration, the Dutch accessed Java through the Sunda Strait in 1596. Then, in 1602, the Dutch did something that changed the world forever. They founded the Verenigd Oost-Indisch Company, the Dutch East India Company, the first company in the world to issue shares to the public, the first mega corporation, and the first multinational. The Dutch Republic granted it the power to form colonies, appoint governors, negotiate treaties, coin money, and kill people for cloves. The company raised an army and a navy larger than those of most European states and seized the spice trade from Portugal. Portugal held on to Goa and some smaller Indian colonies until they were ceded to India in 1961, and it retained control of East Timor until 1975. But its great power status ended when Malacca, that pivot of Southeast Asia, fell to the company in 1641. This was a new way of projecting power. The company acted as a proxy for the Dutch state, which could deny responsibility for its actions. In 1606, the company made the first confirmed European landing on Australian soil and charted much of Australia's coast over the following decades. Until 1824, even the British called Australia New Holland. And while the Dutch claimed parts of New Holland, they never activated those claims through occupation. They were traders and didn't see New Holland as a market or source of trade goods. England's defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 enabled English traders to access the Indian Ocean, and by 1601 England's East India Company had reached the East Indies. The English traders embraced piracy, with English pirates literally recognised by royal appointment. The English established a small militarised trading base in Java, and small conflicts erupted between the Dutch and English companies, eventually breaking out into a series of full-scale wars between 1652 and 1784. From 1619, the English company established ports and forts in India to support East Indies trade, with the Dutch and French following suit. England continued to use pirates as proxies, with William Dampier hunting Spanish traders near the Philippines. In 1689, he hid from the Spanish on the Western Australian coast. Dampier's book of his pirating exploits, A New Voyage Around the World, was the second most popular book of the 17th century after the Bible. Dampier returned to Australia in 1699, the commander of a Royal Navy vessel. His follow-up blockbuster, A Voyage to New Holland, increased British interest in Australia. In the mid-18th century, philosopher Pierre-Louis Moreau du Maupertuis suggested 12 projects for the French advancement of human knowledge, one of which was the exploration of the Southern Hemisphere. In 1766, Louis-Antoine de Bougainville took up the challenge and explored the South Pacific in the world's first great scientific voyage of discovery. This served as the model for the 1768-71 voyage of Britain's James Cook, who charted much of the South Pacific and made the first confirmed European landing on Australia's east coast. Cook claimed eastern Australia for Britain, naming it New South Wales, while French explorers claimed parts of Western Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand and several Pacific islands. The competition between Britain and France in the Southwest Pacific had begun. It's commonly believed that Britain established a convict colony in New South Wales in 1788 because it desperately needed somewhere to dump all its pickpockets, sheep thieves and Irishmen. But there were three other strategic reasons for settlement. First, Britain wanted to establish a base in the Pacific to weaken French influence. Second, it believed the colony might produce cotton and spice, and hemp and pine needed to make rope, canvas and masts for Royal Navy vessels. Third, it believed the colony might serve as a resupply and trading base to allow Britain to operate more freely across both the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Britain's colonisation of New South Wales was truly an Indo Pacific and a military project. New South Wales naval and army governors were concerned the colony's isolation and limited population made it an attractive target for foreign powers. For decades, France was believed to pose the greatest security risk. The two ships of the Comte de la Pérouse, who'd been tasked to establish new Pacific trade routes for France, arrived at Botany Bay days after the first British colonists. La Pérouse built Australia's first mainland fort before leaving. Nicolas Baudin and his pet monkey raced Matthew Flinders and his pet cat around New Holland between 1801 and 1803 in an attempt to determine if it was a single continent. Baudin named Southern Australia Terra Napoleon, and Francois Perron, a zoologist come spy in his party, prepared plans on attacking Sydney and other strategic sites for Napoleon. France had never occupied the Australian and New Zealand territories it had claimed, meaning those claims had no legal effect. But Baudin, drowning his sorrows with a British officer following the death of his monkey, confided that he was thinking of colonising Van Diemen's Land, now Tasmania. Britain had a policy that strictly limited expansion in Australia, as containing the convicts would be more difficult in a broadly settled area. But concern about French territorial ambitions led to the settlement of Van Diemen's Land in 1803, with other strategic East Coast sites following. Concerns about French colonialism led Britain to claim Australia's north coast in 1825, establishing Port Essington, and found the Swan River Colony, soon renamed Western Australia, in 1829. Without the French, Australia's history would be very different. By this stage, the British East India Company had seized much of the Indian subcontinent and Burma, now Myanmar. Britain, the world's greatest naval power, dominated the Indian Ocean. Dutch influence on the Malay Peninsula had weakened during the 18th century, with Siam, now Thailand, the only Southeast Asian state to avoid colonisation, encroaching on the Malay Sultanates from the north. In 1791, the British East India Company was granted the island of Penang in return for military assistance against Siam. The company then refused the promised aid and sold out its northern Malay allies to the Siamese, who acknowledged British sovereignty over Penang and Province Wellesley, centred around Butterworth, a name you will all be familiar with. Sir Stamford Raffles secured the port of Singapore from the Sultan of Johor in 1819. Under the Anglo-Dutch Treaty of 1824, Britain took Dutch territories in India and Malacca, gave its territories in what is now Indonesia to the Dutch, and purchased the rest of Singapore from Johor. Britain now controlled the Indo Pacific Gateway. The Malay Peninsula was left to British influence, with the East India Company administering the Straits settlements of Penang, Malacca and Singapore. This would have been the perfect time for the Australian colonies to strengthen trading links with Asia. Instead, they abandoned their only northern settlement in 1848 and took a hostile position towards Asia generally and China specifically. China had remained the dominant Asian power and continued tribute through trade arrangements in Southeast Asia. However, its influence imploded following its 1842 defeat by Britain in the First Opium War, the start of China's century of humiliation. Western powers had been complaining of their large trade deficits with China. Sound familiar? Britain addressed this by greenlighting the East India Company to illegally sell opium into China. When China sought to halt the devastating trade, Britain sent in the Royal Navy. Under the Treaty of Nanking, China was forced to open 5 ports to foreign merchants, exempt foreigners from most Chinese laws, and cede Hong Kong to Britain. France and the US then insisted on similar treaty arrangements, with part of Shanghai conceded to France in 1849. Still dissatisfied with trade, Britain and France launched the Second Opium War in 1856, forcing legalisation of the opium trade, the ceding of Kowloon to Britain, and a monetary tribute. China conceded territory to both in the port city of Tianjin, and over the following decades was forced to cede parts of Tianjin to 5 other European powers, the US and Japan. 2 weeks after the Second Opium War ended, Russia forced China to surrender territory on the Pacific, allowing it to build the port of Vladivostok. Over the following decades, China lost territory and influence to France, as France took control of Indochina and Xinjiang. The loss of the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895 saw China lose Korea as a tributary state, with Japan replacing China as the dominant Asian power. In 1898, Germany attacked and occupied a naval base China was constructing in Qingdao. China was forced to lease Qingdao to Germany for 99 years, allowing Germany to establish a Pacific Navy base for its Far East Squadron. 6 European powers, the US and Japan, occupied Beijing after their troops put down the Boxer Rebellion in 1901. In 1903, Britain invaded Chinese-administered Tibet. Yet despite China's loss of power and its inability to secure its own territories, Australians continued to view China as a threat. Concerns about cheap Chinese goods and labour and the influx of Chinese to the Australian goldfields grew into full-blown paranoia about Chinese invasion. Indeed, Australians were concerned that they might be attacked by just about anyone. From the early 1840s, forts, batteries and coal bunkers were built around Australian ports to protect against Russian invasion. The colony of Victoria built Australia's first 2 warships in response to Russia's 1878 victory in the Russo-Turkish War, with fears of a Russian attack lasting until the century's end. The French, who'd started rebuilding their empire in 1830, remained a concern. France forced Tahiti to become a protectorate in 1842, annexed it in 1880, and conquered the Leeward Islands in 1897, forming French Polynesia. In 1853, France took possession of New Caledonia to Australia's east and made it a penal colony. The eastern Australian colonies had just stopped accepting British convicts and didn't want French ones moving in next door, or a launch pad for French attacks so close to their shores. France secured Cochin China, now southern Vietnam, between 1858 and 1864. The remaining provinces of modern Vietnam and Laos were incorporated into French Indochina by 1893, with China forced to renounce previous claims in the region. But the greatest source of Australian-French tension was the New Hebrides, present-day Vanuatu. The New Hebrides were Australia's primary source of blackbirded workers, Indigenous people who were cajoled or just plain old kidnapped to labour on mainland Australian plantations. Australian planters settled the New Hebrides from the mid-1800s, but were soon outnumbered by French arrivals. While the settlers clamoured for French or British rule, those powers declared the New Hebrides neutral territory. In 1887, Britain and France established a joint naval commission to defend their citizens from foreign powers. The Australian colonies were horrified Britain was accommodating the traditional enemy on its doorstep. But Britain saw the dispute as a minor one in the context of its competition with France in Africa. In 1906, France and Britain agreed to jointly govern the New Hebrides, with each establishing its own legal, justice, health and education systems, with residents able to pick the system they would live under. The condominium, as it was called, was inefficient, but it kept the peace. The US entered Southeast Asia in 1832, when President Jackson sent the USS Potomac to attack Sumatran pirates who'd massacred an American merchant crew. The US formed the East India Squadron in 1835 to protect US merchant interests. Britain's withdrawal from Oregon and Washington in 1846, the defeat of Mexico in 1848, and the purchase of Alaska from Russia in 1867 resulted in the US going from having no Pacific coast to being a major Pacific power. In 1856, the US declared any island unclaimed by another great power on which guano, i.e. bird poo, was found, was US territory. Several Pacific islands were acquired in this way, and President Grant narrowly averted conflict with Britain when he renounced a US claim over Western Australian islands. In 1898, US backing of Cuban independence resulted in the Spanish-American War. The US Navy's Asiatic Squadron extended the conflict into the Pacific, defeating the Spanish squadron at Manila Bay. The squadron stared down British, French, Japanese and German warships that were in Manila at the time. The US, which also annexed Hawaii during the war, had demonstrated it was the top dog in a contested region and acquired Spain's Pacific possessions, Guam and the Philippines. The Filipinos, who'd launched one of Southeast Asia's first nationalist insurrections against Spain in 1896, fought the occupying Americans until 1902. Germany and the US had purchased Spain's remaining Pacific islands in 1899 and 1901. With Puerto Rico and Cuba also seized by the US, Spain had lost its empire. In 1899, the US and Britain had faced off against Germany, with the two forces backing opposing sides in a Samoan civil war. The three powers ultimately divided Samoa between Germany and the US. The US now controlled the Eastern and Central Pacific. Now, the division of Samoa was welcomed in Australia because as part of the deal, Germany gave Britain the Solomon Islands, which were far closer to Australia. By the 1880s, Germany was the Australian colony's primary security concern. In 1883, Queensland took possession of Eastern New Guinea to deter Germany's planned colonisation. Britain was not amused by an upstart colony involving itself in the empire's external affairs and disallowed the annexation. The Germans moved into northeast New Guinea the following year. While Britain established a protectorate in the island's southeast to provide a buffer between Germany and its Australian colonies, Australians felt betrayed. For the first time, Australians recognised their security interests did not always align with those of the motherland. Britain had, by this stage, unified its trade and military colonial arms. The Indian Rebellion of 1857, which devastated India, led to the Crown nationalising the East India Company. The flag had displaced trade, and Britain was now well and truly the mistress of an empire that drew most of its economic strength and many of its troops from India. The Australian colonies, while sharing cultural ties with Britain, were of secondary importance. Britain stopped garrisoning the Australian colonies in 1870, with New South Wales and Victoria raising small infantry and artillery forces. Britain used the annexation crisis to encourage the colonies to federate as an independent Australia. Federation, Britain suggested, would allow Australia to better protect itself and expand into the Pacific. New South Wales Premier Sir Henry Parkes, in his 1889 Tenterfield oration, argued federation was needed to provide a united defence of the continent. Modern Australia owes its existence to fears of invasion by European powers and China, and recognition of the need to develop an integrated self-defence capacity. The push for independence fanned Australian nationalist sentiment. The sparsely populated nation would need to protect itself from its larger northern neighbours. To do so, it would need to be a white Australia. The new Australian government's 1901 Immigration Restriction Act effectively excluded Asian and most other coloured immigration to Australia. The 1901 Pacific Island Labourers Act sought to deport not only the labourers brought out by blackbirders, but their descendants, with over 7,500 islanders deported. Bans on Pacific Islander immigration were imposed after 1904. Australia had not just turned its back on its Pacific and Southeast Asian neighbours, it had treated them with contempt. Britain, in contrast, was embedded in the Pacific, with Australia, New Zealand, Fiji, Tonga and the Solomon Islands, as well as smaller island groups, part of its empire. British Papua was transferred to Australia in 1905, and smaller island groups gradually transitioned to Australia and New Zealand. But Britain's primary focus was the Indian Ocean, with it being British policy that no other great power should be able to establish bases in the region. Britain had progressively extended its control over the Malay Peninsula and Borneo. By 1914, all Malay states were under British sovereignty, with Brunei reduced to a small territory that agreed to Britain's control of its external affairs, an arrangement that lasted until 1984. Christmas Island and the Cocos Islands, strategic positions in the Indian Ocean, were administered from Singapore. British ports and bases ringed the Indian Oceans, its islands and its approaches. While Britain economically benefited from its Southeast Asian colonies, their primary role was to control access to the Indian Ocean and to provide an eastern buffer to the jewel in the crown of empire, India. Join me for part 2 of this presentation, which starts with the rise of Japan. See you soon.